Your world, your challenges, your faith. When faith within engages the world without, there's power. It's living life from the inside out.
A hallmark of the American church has been its efforts to shelter people fleeing danger. Christians were part of the work after World War II to welcome refugees. The work was motivated by Jesus' call on his people that springs from roots throughout the Old Testament. But there's been a sea change in the country's and the church's posture toward refugees. We'll be talking about the church's place in that change in today's Family Life Inside Out podcast. I'm Martha Manikas Foster, and my guest is Matthew Soerens. He's the U.S. Director of Church Mobilization and Advocacy for World Relief and the National Coordinator of the Evangelical Immigration Table. Welcome back, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you for having me back, Martha.
Matthew, I really appreciate the conversations that we've had, and I know that in addition to your daily work, you've co-authored the books Seeking Refuge and Welcoming the Stranger. So it feels to me like you're the perfect person to talk to us about what and who a refugee is, and how a refugee is distinguished from the more general term of an immigrant. And what are some examples of past world crises where people, through no particular action or fault of their own, have become refugees?
Yeah, well, I think, so just to begin with, a refugee, at least in U.S. law and also international law, is specifically someone who has been forced to flee persecution and flee actually their country. So they've left their country because of persecution that is specifically on account of their race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group. So we could think of various instances throughout history and even going back to the scriptures where groups of people were forced to flee for one of those reasons. Of course, if you go back to the Bible times, they didn't have that legal definition, but even, Jesus himself as a small child, if you think in Matthew chapter 2, when Joseph is warned in a dream that Herod, this paranoid, tyrannical Middle Eastern king, is out to kill all the little boys in Bethlehem. That's this particular group that was being persecuted, and Joseph and Mary and Jesus flee to Egypt, outside of the bounds of Herod's dominion, where they would be safe. So in that sense, even Jesus himself is a refugee. We could go through world history and see various instances where sometimes very large groups of people were forced to flee persecution. Obviously, one that you mentioned even in your intro was during World War II. Jewish people, especially in Germany, but in other parts of Europe, as the Nazis took over parts of Europe, were forced to flee if they were able to. And sometimes they were able to find another country that would provide them shelter and safety. And the reality is sometimes they were turned away as well. And that's part of the story of refugees fleeing persecution, is sometimes being welcomed and protected, and sometimes being turned away. And sadly, that sometimes meant being turned back to the danger and the persecution that they were fleeing in the first place, and sometimes facing death. Refugees are a subset of immigrants. Immigrants are people from one country who live in another. Now, that's a broad term, but refugees are defined really specifically by the reason that they left their country, which wasn't by choice, but because of that threat of persecution.
So when somebody wants more economic opportunity or education that might not otherwise be available at home, that would not fit into that definition. Is that right?
Not if that's the sole motivator for why they're leaving. They may want more education, they may want more economic opportunity, but they only meet the definition of a refugee if they have fled persecution because of one of those reasons under the law, at least in the U.S. context. So anyone who the U.S. government recognizes as a refugee, our government has verified that they meet that definition. They fled their country. Let's say they fled the Democratic Republic of Congo to Tanzania or to Kenya, and in that second country, the U.S. government has verified the reason that they fled was related to persecution. In that case, it's probably based on their ethnicity or political opinion. Another group that we see a lot of refugees are persecuted Christians, for example, from Burma, or also known as Myanmar. They're a small percentage of all people living in Burma, but because of their Christian faith, they're targeted by the Burmese government and forced to flee, often to camps in Thailand, or the same with some Middle Eastern Christians, like in Iraq or Iran or Syria. So there's various groups of refugees. The reason for the persecution varies, but they're not a refugee legally unless that is the reason they fled their country.
So the need to help people after World War II is what birthed our country's refugee resettlement programs, including your organization, World Relief, established by evangelical Christians. And so this was born, as I understand it, born of war relief, but the way that the world works, or the world doesn't work sometimes, the need continued. What are some people groups that the American church has helped to feed and clothe and welcome in the past?
Yeah, I think the first group that comes to mind, because it really, while the resettlement program did definitely begin in the days after World War II, it was then formalized in 1980 with the Refugee Act that was passed by the U.S. Congress and signed by, at the time, President Carter.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in the context of a large number of people fleeing Vietnam, a very large number, and some of the surrounding countries as well. And obviously the U.S. was involved militarily there. And I think a lot of Americans realized that as people who had largely been our allies in Vietnam, in the war, were being persecuted and killed and forced to flee, that we had an opportunity and maybe even a moral responsibility to stand with them and offer them shelter. So an incredible number of people from Vietnam, from some of the surrounding countries, Laos, Cambodia, had a similar conflict occurring around the same time, came to the U.S. For example, in 1980 alone, there was 220,000 refugees who came into the United States.
Really?
And largely, those people were met by religious organizations. So for World Relief, our refugee program started in the late 70s with a missionary couple from the Christian Missionary Alliance denomination who had served in Vietnam planting churches and had come back to the U.S. and was working stateside. And when Saigon fell and they started receiving messages, telegrams, phone calls from some of the people in the churches they had helped to start saying, "We've had to flee. We're desperate. Can you do anything to help?" And so they started knocking on doors, both with the U.S. government, with the U.S. State Department, and then with local churches that had supported them as missionaries, and said, once they got the permissions from the government, "This family's arriving at the airport. Will you be there to pick them up?" And eventually they ran out of churches within their own denomination, and they came to the National Association of Evangelicals and to World Relief, which was founded out of the NAE, and said, "Could you help us work with a broader range of evangelical churches?" And that was really the foundations of our refugee resettlement program. And I still have colleagues at World Relief who were settled during that period, 30, 40 years ago.
Wow.
And it's actually really beautiful to see the Vietnamese churches that are thriving today out of that experience and the economic contributions that those people have made. Actually, if you look at Vietnamese Americans today who are almost entirely either refugees or their family members, they are less likely to live in poverty than the average American. They're more likely to be employed. They're doing really well and contributing in so many different ways. And I think, we've seen that story repeated with various groups. There was the Sudanese lost boys, as they were known, and there was also some lost girls, but largely parentless children who were forced to flee what is now South Sudan, but was part of unified Sudan at that point. And some of them were in camps, often in Kenya or elsewhere, for many years, and then were allowed to be resettled to the United States. And those are folks that World Relief got the privilege of resettling, a number of years ago now. And again, in more recent years, the number one groups that we've seen are actually Congolese from the Democratic Republic of Congo and Burmese coming out of Southeast Asia. And the reasons they flee are distinct. In Burma, it's often religious persecution for those who are Christians, and then a smaller number who are persecuted as Muslims. It's a Buddhist majority country. In Congo, it's more there's tribal violence and an ongoing civil war that has been going on, unfortunately, for several decades. And most of those folks are actually Christians as well, who come and join local churches here in the United States, and as they're welcomed by local churches in the United States.
If you're just beginning to listen, you found the Family Life Inside Out podcast. Today I'm talking about the situations refugees face. My guest is Matthew Soerens of World Relief. Matthew, I think you've painted the picture that the most dangerous places in the world are the places people are running from in order to stay alive. But that same danger can make us as Americans hesitant to welcome people from those places. What are some current world situations, and you've mentioned some, where people are fleeing their homes and countries? What are some situations where there are refugees who need a place to go?
Yeah, I think it's very astute to note that in some ways the strange dynamic is we see refugees fleeing, and most Americans, and I think especially Christians, we feel compassion. We want to help, but it's a very natural human thing to then start to wonder what they're fleeing from and to not want whatever they're fleeing from to reach us. And so there's this tension between compassion and maybe a bit of fear, or at least caution. I think one of the conflicts in the world that's gotten a lot of attention in the last few years, and appropriately so, is the civil war in Syria. And it's probably gotten a little bit of less attention in the last year or two, but not because the situation is resolved. The number who have fled from Syria since the civil war there began 7 or 8 years ago now is incredible. It's more than 5 million people. And that doesn't include those who are displaced within Syria, they fled their homes but have not actually crossed the border. But you've got more than 2 million, nearly 3 million refugees living in Turkey right now from the Syrian conflict, roughly 1 million in Lebanon, perhaps about the same in Jordan. It's actually a very small number who've come to the United States, a much, much smaller number, maybe 10, 15,000, and now very few are coming. But I think part of that dynamic is people see terrorism in Syria. They see a brutal governmental situation, and they want to help people, but they also want to be cautious. And that's true that's been true historically. We talked about the Vietnamese. A lot of Americans didn't want Vietnamese refugees coming back in the 70s and 80s because the concern was they were going to somehow bring communism with them. There was even Americans who were suspicious of Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis because they thought they might be Nazis in disguise. That was
goodness.
the rhetoric of the 40s and even the 30s, the late 30s. Now, that doesn't make sense to us now, knowing what we know historically, but people were not fully aware of what was happening, especially in the build-up to World War II. And there was some pretty ugly anti-Jewish sentiment in the United States at that time that was part of, under the government, for example, of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, turning away Jewish refugees.
So that's the famous story of the ship that came so close to our waters and then was turned away? Yeah.
Yep, that's right. And again, there was people out speaking out against that at the time, but there's also a lot of support for that at the time because the rhetoric was those people could be a threat to us. And that's kind of in some ways a classic American story of competing narratives of is this compassion or is this foolishness to take these vulnerable people?
Well, is there a way to be both welcoming and safe?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I firmly believe that there is, that these are not mutually exclusive ideas, that we can be a compassionate nation and the church can be compassionate while also expecting our government to keep Americans safe. And the good news is, we have a lot more technology and infrastructure in place now than we did in the 70s or in the 30s and 40s. We actually, in the last 40 years, have developed a really strong system as a nation of vetting refugees, of verifying who they are, of making sure that they indeed are people who meet that legal definition, having fled persecution for a reason under U.S. law, and then making sure that we're not admitting anyone who has any sort of intent to harm the United States of America. So that process for vetting refugees involves usually, just for the very small percentage who get considered for resettlement to the United States, which, for context, last year it was about 30,000 refugees who came in out of 25 million refugees in the world. So talking roughly 0.1% of the world's refugees who even get considered at this point on an annual basis. But every one of those went through a vetting process that involved multiple in-person interviews with agents of the U.S. government, of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, as well as background checks and retina scans and a health exam. And it's been a really successful process, especially in the last several decades, since, let's say, 1980, when the Refugee Act was signed into law. And this process for vetting refugees began to be established, and it was improved, of course, in years since then. But since 1980, we've had more than 3 million refugees resettled to the United States, not just through World Relief, but through various faith-based and nonprofit organizations. And not a single one of those 3 million refugees has taken the life of an American citizen in a terrorist attack. That's actually a really great record, and I think a credit to the officers of our government who have a tough job to vet people, to make sure we're bringing in genuine refugees and not bringing in people who do harm. And that's not to say every person who's ever come in is a perfect person. I mean, they're flawed human beings like the rest of us, but they have largely done their job really well of keeping out those who would want to do harm and bringing in those who are genuine refugees who fled persecution. And in the process, the United States government has saved probably millions of lives.
And the vetting is done by the government, not by the resettlement agencies?
That's right. So our job starts at the moment a family arrives at the airport, and probably a few days or weeks before that, as we start setting up an apartment and working with local churches to find volunteers who are basically going to walk alongside that family throughout their adjustment into life in a new country. We don't have any say in who gets to come. That's the U.S. government's job. But we are happy to take whoever they decide should be coming. And then, again, our mission at World Relief is to empower the church. So we're, whenever possible, connecting people to a team from a local church who's going to walk alongside them as they adjust to life in a new country, learn a new language, find a job. Most refugees are at least adults, are into a job within about 90 days. And frankly, right now, that's not hard to do. There's a lot of jobs available in the U.S. right now,
and there's also
for those who may not have great English skills at this point. So,
and there's also fewer refugees being admitted, right?
Well, that's definitely true, and that's, I think, it's been discouraging for us at World Relief. It's the number of refugees just in the last few years. It was in 2016, there was about 96,000 refugees who came to the U.S., And that's, fairly high in the last, in the last few decades at least. Although, again, if you go back to 80, it was more than 200,000.
Right.
But now we're down to, in the last few years, it's in the area of 20, 30,000. And this year it's actually going to be capped at 18,000. So that'll be the lowest ever in history.
That is a decrease.
Since the refugee program began in 1980. And that's disappointing to us because, we work with people who've already been resettled, who often have family members still in refugee camps, some of whom have been there literally for decades. And we can't tell them for sure when they'll be able to come or if they'll be able to come because there's so few slots and there's more refugees in the world today than there's been at any point in recorded history.
Any point in recorded history. That's incredible. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's somewhere around 25, 26 million.
Wow. You mentioned that, you partner with churches. That's what you do. What are a church's options, an individual church's options, if they want to have a role in this resettlement?
Yeah. For those who happen to be close to a World Relief Office, we would love to help them get connected. There's other resettlement agencies as well. Most of the resettlement agencies are faith-based, so the Catholic Church is actually the largest resettlement agency in the U.S. There's a Lutheran Immigration Refugee Services, Church World Service, there's various others. And all of them have volunteer opportunities, ways for individuals or teams from a church to be a friend to a newly arrived family. Oh, and I should also say, frankly, right now, because so few families are arriving, we don't always have a newly arrived family. The office where I work out of in Illinois, we haven't had a family arrive since November. That's just the reality of a pretty dramatic slowdown on the governmental side.
Right.
But there's still families who've been in the community for a few years who would still love someone to practice English with, or just some of the cultural adjustment things like learning how to do grocery shopping or how to understand the letter coming home from your kid's school, or for kids, helping tutor kids in their homework. Most refugee parents are very committed to their kids' education. They know that that's the secret to achieving the American dream is education. But some of them haven't had the opportunity to be educated in English, so it's hard for them to help their kids with their homework sometimes. So that's something the church can play a really important role in, is just helping kids with homework and studying. And in the process, we see, again, a lot of refugees are already strong Christians. And frankly, Christians who've been persecuted for their faith and have some things to teach the average American Christian who has never experienced that and, God willing, won't experience that. But there are also refugees who come from other religious backgrounds, and many of them are interacting with Christians for the first time in their lives here in the United States. And that gives all sorts of opportunities, never in a coercive way, but it's I think in scriptures we're told to be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is within you. And we see those questions come up quite often when it's a team from a church who becomes let's say a Muslim family or a Hindu family's closest friends in the United States. And we don't force our Christian faith on them. We believe in religious freedom in this country, where people can choose for themselves how or if to follow God and how they want to understand that. But we do see families, when they're loved well by the church, they have lots of questions about who Jesus is. And we've seen families make the decision to become followers of Jesus in this country through the witness and the service and the love of local churches.
In some ways, you've said to me in the past when we've had conversations that the Great Commission is coming to us in many ways when we help to resettle a family.
It is. Yeah, it's it's a unique thing. We're called to go make disciples of all nations, and we find that in Matthew 28. In Acts 1, where it's sort of a similar commission, go into all the world and make disciples. But we also see that in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And sometimes I think we want to start at the ends of the earth, and we forget that God has sent people to our communities as well. And that it's both and, right? It's not one or the other. But we're missing something really profound if we don't notice that God has sent people from various nations, and frankly from nations without a lot of religious liberty, where if we went to them there, we'd be asking them to make a decision to follow Jesus. That means potentially losing their life, or at least, social isolation. In the U.S., there's not governmental interference in how we decide to practice or not our faith. And that is really a unique opportunity. But it's also not an automatic thing. And I think I worry sometimes that if the church in the U.S. responds to refugees in a way that's purely driven by, some media narratives that are more on the focus on, is this safe? Are we, is this secure? And we don't ask the biblical question of who is my neighbor, we might miss out on that opportunity. It might not be the Christians who are the people meeting people at the airport. And then we don't have that opportunity to show the love of Jesus in both deed and in word.
I mean, a lot of the people that you're mentioning, a lot of the conflict and the let's say source countries or country of origin that a refugee would come from, it's not unlike looking at the world map that Open Doors gives of the World Watch List of places where there's great persecution. And I think we have reason to believe that persecution of Christians in those countries often is persecution of others as well. And so the very people that we are praying for, those of us who follow the World Watch List and pray for the situations and the people in those situations, some of those people are the people who would be coming to us.
Yeah, that is absolutely right. And I think it's also important to know that when we, as a nation, resettle far fewer refugees of any background, that affects those who are persecuted Christians as well. In fact, the number of refugees from the 50 countries on that Open Doors World Watch List for 2020, the number of Christian refugees in particular was more than 20,000 as recently as 2014. It was 17,000 in 2016. In 2019, it was 5,787. So it's a decline just from 2016 to 2019 of about two-thirds in the number of Christian refugees from the 50 countries on that Open Doors World Watch List. And in particular cases from Pakistan, the number of Christians is down about 90%. From Iran, the number of Christians being resettled just since 2016 to 2019 is down 95%. So there's some really stark declines in the number of persecuted Christians that the U.S. is receiving now. And I suspect a lot of Americans and a lot of American Christians haven't realized that. But that's just, I don't think that persecuted Christians are being uniquely excluded on purpose. I think it's just the effect of a much lower number of refugees overall being allowed in. And since the majority of refugees coming to the U.S. in the last few years have been Christians, that's going to affect Christians while also affecting Muslims and those of other faith backgrounds.
So the benefits to the kingdom of being welcoming to people who are being persecuted, people who are refugees for a variety of reasons, but the reasons that they're fleeing are dire situations. Both those people who do not have a faith or do not have a faith that's Christian, the opportunity for the Christian church to welcome them, as well as the opportunity to bring in people who are being persecuted because they follow Jesus. Those are all things that are swirling in the question of whether or not or how we welcome refugees into the United States, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's both an opportunity to live out the Great Commission, as you said, and then on the flip side, it's an opportunity to stand with the persecuted church and to live out those words Jesus says in Matthew chapter 25, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. And Jesus goes on, and the disciples are confused, saying, when did we see you, Jesus, hungry or thirsty or a stranger or sick or in prison? And he says, whatever you did to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it unto me. And we have Christian brothers and sisters persecuted for their faith who would love to come to the United States, and as a nation and then as individuals and as churches, we can either be the people there to welcome them, or we can say, sorry, we're full, or we don't want you. And I mean, that breaks my heart, honestly, because I know how deeply God loves each human person, both those who are already followers of Jesus and then those who are not, who might come to know him through the interaction of the church.
Well, on that, great wisdom and lots to think about. On that, Matthew, I'm going to thank you for once again talking with me today for Inside Out on Family Life.
I'm so glad to be with you, Martha. Thanks for the opportunity.
You've been listening to Inside Out on Family Life and my guest, Matthew Soerens, U.S. Director of Church Mobilization and Advocacy for World Relief and the National Coordinator of the Evangelical Immigration Table. You can learn more about Matthew Soerens and World Relief by using the links on the podcast page that accompanies this conversation. You'll find that at fln.org/insideout. I'm Martha Manikas Foster with this Inside Out report on Family Life.